The coffee cup shattered against the floor before anyone realized it had slipped from Susan Miller's hand, the sound sharp enough to cut through the low hum of conversation in the diner. Heads turned. Forks froze mid-air. A woman near the window gasped softly. Susan didn't move. She stood there staring at the empty space where the man across from her had been sitting just seconds ago, her breath shallow, her ears ringing. Her heart thudding so hard it felt physical, like a bruise forming from the inside out. What kind of man walks away from a woman? Mid-sentence leaves his coat behind and says, "I don't do this," as if she were a defective product he'd accidentally picked up off the wrong shelf. Susan had agreed to this blind date knowing better. 48 years old, divorced, body softened by time stress and years of night shifts at the hospital. She had told herself it was just dinner, just conversation, nothing to lose. Yet somehow sitting alone now in Maple Street Diner, with her hands trembling and her chest tight, it felt like she had lost something anyway. Mark Dalton had barely looked at her when he stood. No shouting, no scene. Just a lean back in his chair, a slow scan of her body that lingered a fraction too long, and a quiet voice pitched low enough to be private, but sharp enough to slice clean through her. "You should have been honest about your size," he'd said. "I don't waste time on women who let themselves go." Then he'd walked away. The words echoed long after the bell above the door jingled and fell silent again. Susan swallowed hard, her throat burning. Around her, the diner resumed its rhythm. But something had shifted. A man at the counter pretended not to stare. A couple in a corner booth exchanged glances. No one spoke. No one intervened. Shame has a way of making a room feel enormous, and Susan felt very small inside it. She reached for her coffee with unsteady fingers. Missed. That was when the cup hit the floor. "Ma'am," a waitress asked gently, already crouching to help. Susan shook her head, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed her. She bent to pick up the shards herself, as if cleaning could somehow fix what had just happened. From the table beside her, a chair scraped softly against the tile. Thomas Reed had been watching, though he wished he hadn't. Not because he didn't care, but because caring always came with a cost. At 55, Thomas had learned that lesson the hard way. He sat stiffly now, his posture straight, his jaw tight, eyes flicking from Susan to the empty chair across from her, then to the door where Mark had exited. His daughter Lily paused mid-sentence. "Dad," she whispered. Her fork hovered above her plate, forgotten. Across from her, Thomas's mother, Ruth, followed his gaze and sighed the sound heavy with recognition. "Eat your dinner," Ruth murmured to Lily, though her eyes stayed on Susan. "Some men never grow up." Thomas said nothing. He didn't stand. He didn't rush over. Not yet. He took a slow breath, the kind he'd learned to take in boardrooms and construction sites when tempers flared and decisions carried consequences. His instincts pulled him forward. His caution held him back. He had responsibilities, a child watching him, a reputation carefully maintained. "You don't insert yourself into other people's messes," he reminded himself. "You don't make scenes." But then Mark came back. He stepped just inside the doorway. Jacket slung over one shoulder. Annoyance etched across his face as he scanned the room. His eyes landed on Susan again, still bent near the table, still collecting broken pieces of porcelain with shaking hands. Something flickered in his expression. Not regret. Irritation. "Hey," he called, his voice louder this time. "Just so we're clear, this isn't about personality. It's about standards." The room went quiet. The kind of quiet that presses in on you, waiting to see who will flinch first. Susan froze. Thomas stood. The movement was deliberate. No sudden gestures, no raised voice. Just a man unfolding from his chair, tall and solid, drawing attention without asking for it. Ruth inhaled sharply. Lily's eyes widened. "That's enough," Thomas said. Mark turned surprised, then amused. He gave Thomas a once-over, the practiced glance of someone who judges quickly and often. "This doesn't concern you," he replied. Thomas met his gaze evenly. "It does now." For a moment, the air between them felt charged, taut, as a wire pulled too tight. Thomas didn't insult him, didn't threaten him. He didn't need to. His voice stayed calm, almost conversational, but there was something in it that carried weight. Something that suggested he was not a man, accustomed to being ignored. "You said what you wanted," Thomas continued. "You've made your point. Leave." Mark scoffed, or what Thomas took a single step forward, not aggressive, not inviting, just enough to close the space. "Or you stay," he said quietly, "and you explain why you think humiliating a stranger in public makes you feel powerful." Mark's smile faltered. The room was watching now, not recording, not whispering. Watching. He muttered something under his breath and turned on his heel, the door swinging shut behind him with a final chime. Thomas exhaled slowly, the tension draining just enough to remind him how tight his shoulders had been. He returned to his table without another word, as if nothing unusual had happened. Susan remained still. Her hands trembled harder now. Tears blurred her vision, hot and unwelcome. She hated herself for letting them come. She hated that a stranger had seen her like this. She hated that another stranger had felt compelled to step in. Ruth rose from her seat, smoothing her sweater. "I'm going to the restroom," she told Thomas softly. "Keep an eye on Lily." She paused beside Susan's table, her voice low and kind. "Take your time, dear." Susan nodded, unable to speak. Thomas watched his mother walk away, then looked at his daughter. Lily studied him with the serious gaze of a child who notices more than adults think she does. "You did the right thing," she said. Thomas's mouth twitched. "We'll talk later." He waited, counted his breaths, gave Susan space. When she finally straightened, wiping her eyes with a napkin, he approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to interfere. I just didn't like how that went." Susan looked up at him. Really looked. The lines at the corners of his eyes, the steadiness in his expression, the way he stood as if he were used to holding his ground. "Thank you," she said quietly. Thomas nodded once. "If you need anything," he added, then hesitated. "If you want to sit for a minute. You don't have to be alone." The offer hung there. no pressure, no assumption. Susan glanced at the empty chair across from her, then at Thomas's table, where a young girl watched her with open curiosity. She felt exposed, raw. Yet beneath it all, something else stirred. Not hope. Not yet. Something closer to relief. She gathered her purse with careful hands. Maybe she said. Across the diner, unseen by all of them, the owner watched from behind the counter. His eyes narrowed, his jaw set. He recognized Thomas Reed. Everyone in town did, whether they knew why or not. And as he reached for the phone beneath the register, he wondered if this small, ugly moment was about to become something much bigger than anyone in that room could imagine. Susan noticed the way people looked at her as she crossed the diner floor. The looks polite but heavy, the kind that lingered a second too long. She felt exposed like a bruise uncovered. Thomas walked a half step ahead, not guiding her, not touching her, just close enough to signal presence without ownership. Lily watched them approach with solemn curiosity, her small hands folded on the table, her eyes sharp and assessing in a way that reminded Susan uncomfortably of herself at that age. "Hi," Lily said. Not shy, not rude, just honest. "Hi," Susan replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. She slid into the chair Thomas pulled out for her, the vinyl cool against the backs of her legs. For a second, she didn't know where to put her hands. Then she folded them in her lap and sat up straighter, like someone who had decided not to apologize for existing. Ruth returned a moment later, her gaze flicking from Susan's face to Thomas's with quiet understanding. She said nothing as she took her seat, only nodded once at Susan. It was not an invitation. It was an acknowledgement. The waitress appeared, sensing opportunity. "Can I get you something fresh?" she asked Susan. "Coffee." "Tea." "Coffee," Susan said. "Thank you." She hesitated. "And I'll pay." Ruth smiled faintly. "We'll sort it out later." For a few moments, no one spoke. The diner noise wrapped around them again, forks clinking a radio, murmuring low behind the counter. Susan's heartbeat slowed. Her hands stopped shaking. "I'm Thomas," he said at last. "This is my daughter Lily. And my mother Ruth." "Susan," she replied. "Nice to meet you." She glanced at Lily. "Your dad. He didn't have to do that." Lily shrugged. "He always does that." Thomas shot her a look. "That's not true." "It is," Lily said calmly. "You just don't notice." Ruth's lips curved slightly. Susan felt something warm flicker in her chest, unexpected and unwelcome. "I wasn't sure if I should speak up," Thomas admitted, his tone measured. "I usually don't." Susan studied him. "Why did you?" Thomas paused. His eyes drifted not away from her, but inward. "Because he came back," he said. "And because he wanted the last word." Susan nodded. She understood that instinct intimately. Across the room, the owner leaned heavily on the counter, pretending to polish a mug while watching them through the reflection in the coffee machine. He picked up the phone dialed, then stopped. He set it back down. Not yet, he decided. Some things needed to play out on their own. Susan took a sip of coffee. It burned her tongue. She welcomed the sensation. "I don't usually do blind dates," she said. "I knew better." Ruth tilted her head. Loneliness makes us try things we'd normally avoid. Thomas glanced at his mother. Mom. It does, Ruth repeated, unapologetic. And there's no shame in it. Susan swallowed. He said it quietly, she said. Like it would hurt less that way. Thomas's jaw tightened. It doesn't. No. Susan agreed. It doesn't. Silence stretched again, thicker this time, but not uncomfortable. Lily swung her feet beneath the table, humming softly. Susan noticed the worn edge of Thomas's jacket sleeve, the faint crease in his brow that never quite relaxed. You don't owe us conversation, Thomas said. If you want to leave, I don't. Susan interrupted, surprising herself. She took a breath. If that's okay. It is, he said simply. Outside, Mark stood in the parking lot, phone pressed to his ear. His face flushed with irritation. I'm telling you, he snapped, pacing between the cars. Some guy made a scene. No, I didn't do anything wrong. People are too sensitive. He listened, then scoffed. I don't care who he is. He ended the call and glanced back at the diner. His gaze hard. He didn't notice the black sedan idling across the street, engine running, windows tinted. Inside, Ruth rose to leave, gathering her purse. I'm going to take Lily home, she said to Thomas. You can follow later. Thomas frowned. Mom. I know, Ruth replied, but I'm tired, and I trust you. She turned to Susan. It was nice to meet you. Likewise, Susan said, standing briefly, then sitting again. Lily hugged Susan without warning, her small arms tight and warm. You're okay, Lily whispered, then skipped toward the door with Ruth. Thomas watched them go, his shoulders sagging slightly as the weight shifted. When he turned back to Susan, something in his expression had changed, less guarded, more tired. I'm sorry you had to meet my family like that, he said. Susan smiled faintly. I've met people under worse circumstances. They sat again. The space felt different now. More intimate. More dangerous. You work at the hospital, Thomas said, not a question. Susan blinked. How did you know the badge clip? He replied. You forgot to take it off. She glanced down, then laughed softly. Nurse, she said. Administrative side now. But I started on the floor. Thomas nodded. That changes how you see people. Yes, Susan said. It does. Across the diner, the owner finally made the call. His voice was low. Yeah, he said. He's here. Caused a problem. Name's Mark Dalton. He listened. His eyebrows rose. I see. Thomas shifted in his chair. I should tell you something, he said. Susan tensed. Okay. I'm not just an engineer. Thomas continued. Not anymore. Susan waited. The diner seemed to hold its breath. I oversee projects, he said carefully. Large ones. Public infrastructure. Schools. Hospitals. He watched her reaction. My name carries weight in this county. Sometimes more than I'd like. Susan absorbed this. She thought of the way he'd spoken to Mark, the way the room had listened. Is that why he left? Thomas didn't answer immediately. He left because he didn't want witnesses, he said, finally. Susan nodded. She didn't ask more. She sensed there was more, and that it would come whether she asked or not. Outside, the black sedan rolled forward, headlights cutting across the parking lot. Mark noticed too late. The window slid down. "Mark Dalton," a voice said. "Calm. Controlled. We need to talk." Mark's bravado faltered. "Who are you?" The man smiled without warmth. "Someone who doesn't appreciate men who mistake cruelty for honesty." Inside the diner, Susan leaned back slightly, unaware of the storm gathering just beyond the glass. She felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not attraction. Not yet. Something closer to safety edged with unease. "Thank you," she said to Thomas, "for sitting with me." He met her gaze. "Thank you for staying." Neither of them noticed the owner watching from the counter, his eyes sharp, his expression grim. He had seen this before. Moments that seemed small, ordinary, until they weren't. Moments that cracked something open and let consequences rush in. Outside, Mark's voice rose, then fell silent. Inside, Thomas glanced toward the window. His jaw set, his posture tightening once more. Susan followed his gaze, sensing a shift she couldn't yet name. The night, she realized, wasn't finished with any of them. The first thing Susan noticed was the way Thomas went still, the way his attention snapped toward the window, as if someone had pulled a wire tight inside him. It wasn't panic. It was recognition. The kind that comes from long experience, from knowing when a situation has crossed an invisible line. "Do you need to go?" Susan asked quietly. Thomas didn't answer right away. He watched the parking lot through the glass eyes, narrowed shoulders squared, as if calculating distance and consequence at the same time. Outside, the black sedan idled at an angle that blocked Mark's car, just enough to be deliberate. The headlights cut a hard line across the asphalt. "No," Thomas said finally. "But something's happening." Susan followed his gaze. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw Mark's posture change. The swagger drained out of him fast. His shoulders hunched. His hands lifted slightly, palms out, the universal language of a man who suddenly understands he is not in control. Susan's stomach tightened. "Is that about earlier?" "Yes," Thomas said. He pushed back from the table and stood, not abruptly but with purpose. "Stay here." That wasn't a request, Susan said. Thomas looked at her surprised. For the first time that night, he really saw her. Not the woman who had been humiliated. Not the one who needed rescuing. Someone steady beneath the hurt. "All right," he said. "But stand back." They moved closer to the window together, not touching but aware of each other's presence. Inside the diner, conversations had dipped again. People sensed tension the way animals sense weather. Outside, the driver of the sedan stepped out. Mid-50s, clean cut, dark coat. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke with his hands clasped behind his back. Posture relaxed in a way that suggested authority rather than aggression. Mark said something sharp, defensive. The man listened. Then he spoke again. Mark's face went pale. Susan exhaled slowly. "Who is that?" Thomas didn't look away. "My legal counsel." Susan turned to him. "Your what?" Thomas closed his eyes briefly, as if weighing how much truth could exist in one moment. "I told you my name carries weight," he said. I didn't tell you why. The diner door opened, then a gust of cold air sweeping in with Ruth and Lily as they stepped back inside. Ruth froze when she saw Thomas by the window, his jaw set, his attention fixed outside. "Oh," she said softly. "It started." Susan stared at her. "Started?" Ruth met her gaze with something like apology. "My son has a habit of not explaining things until he has to." Thomas sighed. "Mom." "You always did," Ruth continued. "Even as a boy. You'd wait until the roof was already leaking before telling anyone there was a storm." Lily peered out the window. "Is that the mean man?" "Yes," Thomas said. Lily frowned. "He looks scared." Susan felt a flicker of something like satisfaction, followed immediately by guilt. She folded her arms across her chest, grounding herself. Outside, Mark's voice rose. He gestured sharply, pointing back at the diner. The man from the sedan listened, nodded once, then took out his phone. He didn't dial. He simply held it up, screen, glowing angled, so Mark could see whatever was on it. Mark's shoulders slumped. Inside, the owner wiped his hands on a towel and stepped closer. "Everything all right, Tom?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. Thomas inclined his head slightly. "It will be." The owner glanced at Susan, then back at Thomas. "You sure Thomas met his gaze?" "Yes." The owner nodded. He trusted Thomas Reed. Everyone did. He returned to the counter without another word. Susan turned to Thomas again. "You don't owe me an explanation," she said. "But I don't like feeling like I'm standing in the middle of something I don't understand." Thomas studied her for a long moment. The diner noise faded around them. He made a decision. "Mark Dalton works for a subcontractor," he said. Or he did. "That subcontractor has been bidding on one of my projects, a hospital expansion, the kind of project that keeps a company alive." Susan's breath caught. "You're saying I'm saying." Thomas interrupted gently that how a man treats strangers matters. Not just morally. Practically. Ruth crossed her arms. "Your father used to say the same thing she said. Character always leaks." Susan felt a strange shift inside her. The humiliation from earlier didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It no longer sat solely inside her. It had consequences now. Wait. Outside, Mark shook his head rapidly. He took a step back, nearly tripping over the curb. The man from the sedan didn't follow. He said something final, then turned away, already dialing as he walked back to the car. Mark stood alone in the lot, shoulders sagging, phone buzzing uselessly in his hand. Susan looked away first. She didn't want to watch him fall further. "I didn't ask for this," she said quietly. "I know," Thomas replied. "And it's not about you getting revenge." She laughed once, humorless. "Funny how it feels like that us all anyway." Ruth touched Susan's arm, gentle but firm. "Sometimes justice looks like revenge to people who have never faced consequences." The sedan pulled away. Mark remained staring at the ground, as if it might offer answers. The tension in Thomas's posture eased slightly. He turned back toward the table. "You should finish your coffee," he said. "It's getting cold." Susan nodded, her mind racing. They returned to their seats. Lily climbed onto her chair, swinging her legs again. "Is he in trouble?" Lily asked. Thomas considered. He's going to have a long night, he said. And a longer morning. That's fair, Lily said, satisfied. Susan watched the exchange, the casual honesty, the lack of triumph. It struck her that Thomas wasn't enjoying this. He wasn't savoring power. He was simply allowing cause to meet effect. I need to ask you something, Susan said. Thomas looked up. All right. Does this happen a lot? She asked. People underestimating you, then paying for it. A corner of his mouth twitched. More than you'd think, less than it used to. And you're okay with that. Thomas leaned back, exhaling. I'm tired of it, he admitted. But I don't hide who I am. I just don't announce it. Ruth nodded. It keeps the wrong people honest. Susan sat with that. She thought of Mark's quiet cruelty, the way he'd assumed no one important was listening, the way he'd been wrong. The waitress returned, setting down a fresh cup of coffee without comment. Susan wrapped her hands around it, drawing warmth. I spent years believing men like him were the gatekeepers, Susan said. Like they got to decide who was worthy. Thomas shook his head. They never were. She met his eyes. Then why does it feel like they always win? Thomas's gaze softened. Because we notice the harm more than the quiet corrections. Outside, Mark finally climbed into his car. He didn't look back at the diner as he drove away. The room seemed to breathe again. Conversations resumed. A fork clinked. The radio hummed. Susan realized her shoulders no longer ached from tension. She took a slow sip of coffee. I don't know what happens next, she said. For me, I mean. Thomas nodded. Neither do I. Ruth stood gathering her coat. That's enough excitement for one night, she declared. Lily's shoes. As they prepared to leave, Susan felt a flicker of something unexpected. Not gratitude, not obligation. Choice. Thank you, she said to Thomas as they walked toward the door together. For what he asked, for not pretending none of this mattered. Thomas held the door open. It always matters, he said. The trick is deciding what you do with it. As they stepped out into the cold night, Susan glanced once more at the diner behind them. What had begun as an ordinary, humiliating evening had cracked open into something else entirely. She didn't know yet whether it would heal or hurt. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. She would never see herself the same way again. The parking lot smelled like cold asphalt and spilled gasoline. The kind of smell that always made Susan think of endings rather than beginnings. Ruth ushered Lily into the passenger seat of the old sedan, fussing with the seat belt, while Lily talked non-stop about homework and a science project that involved vinegar and baking soda. Thomas stood beside Susan's car, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders squared against the night air. You don't have to stay, Susan said, surprising herself with how quickly the words came. I'm fine. Thomas studied her face, not searching for weakness, but for truth. I know you are, he said. I didn't mean stay as in guard. I meant be present. Susan nodded. The humiliation from earlier had dulled into something heavier, more complex. It was no longer just pain. It was awareness. Ruth closed the car door and turned to them. We'll see you at home, she said to Thomas. Her eyes flicked to Susan, sharp but kind. Take care of yourself." "You too," Susan replied. As the sedan pulled away, Thomas exhaled slowly. The parking lot felt emptier without the buffer of his family. More honest. "You ready?" he asked. "For what?" Susan replied. "For the rest of the night," he said. "Whatever that looks like." Susan hesitated, then nodded. "I don't want to go home yet." Thomas opened his car door. "Neither do I." They drove without music, the hum of the engine filling the silence. Streetlights passed in steady rhythm, each one briefly illuminating Thomas's profile before sliding away again. Susan watched him from the corner of her eye, the set of his jaw, the way his hands rested on the steering wheel, like he was always prepared for sudden turns. "Does this kind of thing follow you?" she asked finally. Thomas didn't answer right away. The road curved tires, whispering against pavement. "Power attracts assumptions," he said at last. "People think it's loud, flashy. But most of the time, it's just leverage and paperwork." And tonight, Susan asked. "Tonight was personal," he admitted. "That bothers me." Susan nodded. "It bothered me too." They pulled into a small overlook near the river, the water dark and slow beneath the bridge. Thomas cut the engine. The quiet settled around them, broken only by distant traffic. Susan leaned back in her seat, staring through the windshield. "I keep replaying it," she said. What he said. How he said it. Like if I replay it enough, I'll find a version where it doesn't hurt. Thomas turned toward her. "You won't?" She laughed softly. "I know." He waited. He had learned patience the hard way. "I spent years thinking I needed to be smaller." Susan continued. "Quieter, less visible. I thought if I did that, I'd be safe." "And were you?" Thomas asked. She shook her head. "No. I just became easier to ignore." Thomas absorbed that. "You shouldn't have been ignored." Susan looked at him then. Really looked. "You didn't ignore me." "No," he said. "I couldn't." The moment stretched taut but controlled. Susan felt the familiar urge to deflect, to make light of it. But she didn't. She let the silence sit. "Can I ask you something uncomfortable?" she said. Thomas nodded. "You can ask." "Did you step in because you saw yourself in me?" she asked. "Or because you knew you could?" Thomas considered. "Both," he said. "I've been dismissed my entire life. I learned early that if I didn't speak, people would decide things for me." Susan swallowed. "And now," he said, "I speak when it matters." Susan nodded slowly. It mattered. They sat there, the river below reflecting scattered lights like fractured stars. "My ex-husband used to say things like that," Susan said quietly. "Not in public, always private, like it was advice." Thomas's jaw tightened. "That's worse." "It is," she agreed. "Because you start to believe it's for your own good." Thomas reached out, then stopped himself, his hand hovering briefly before dropping back to his lap. "You don't have to explain yourself to me," he said. "Not tonight." Susan appreciated the restraint. It felt rare, precious. They returned to the cars after a while, the cold creeping in. Thomas waited until Susan unlocked her door. "Can I see you again?" he asked. Susan paused, keys still in her hand. Fear stirred, familiar and sharp, but beneath it, something steadier rose. "Yes," she said, but slowly. Thomas smiled, not wide, but genuine. "Slow is good." They parted there, no hug, no lingering touch. Just an understanding that something had shifted. Susan drove home, her mind replaying not Mark's words, but Thomas's stillness, his refusal to escalate his quiet authority. She parked, climbed the stairs to her apartment, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before turning on the light. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She stared at it, heart quickening. Then another buzz. A voicemail notification. She played it. Susan Thomas's voice said calm but firm. "I should have said this earlier. What happened tonight wasn't your fault. It wasn't about you. Don't let it live, rent-free in your head. Sleep. We'll talk soon." She listened twice, then set the phone down. Tears came not sharp this time, but slow, heavy cleansing. Across town, Mark sat alone in his car, knuckles white on the steering wheel. His phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a voicemail. It was an email. Subject line: Contract review. He didn't open it. He already knew. He stared through the windshield, anger curdling into something colder. He wasn't finished. Not with Thomas. Not with Susan. He told himself that power, like Thomas's, always left a trail. Trails could be followed. Back in her apartment, Susan changed into pajamas and stood in front of the mirror. She studied her reflection, the familiar curves, the lines etched by time and stress. For once, she didn't immediately look away. "You're still here," she whispered to herself. The night stretched on, quiet but charged. None of them slept easily. Each carried the weight of the evening differently. For Susan, it was the beginning of a reckoning. For Thomas, a reminder that restraint was as powerful as force. And for Mark, it was the first crack in a story he had always assumed would end with him on top. Morning arrived without mercy. Susan woke before the alarm, the grey light already pushing through the blinds, her mind racing ahead of her body. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a garbage truck backing up somewhere on the street, the ordinary noises of a life that had not stopped just because something inside her had shifted. Then Mark's voice crept in. "You should have been honest about your size." Her chest tightened. She sat up abruptly, swinging her feet to the floor, breathing through the familiar spike of anxiety. This was nothing new. Words like that had lived in her head for years, wearing different faces, using different mouths. What was new was the other voice, now quieter, but steadier. "It wasn't about you." She stood, made coffee, let the routine anchor her. By the time she left for work, she had decided she would not tell anyone about last night, not her co-workers, not the women she ate lunch with in the break room. It felt too raw, too easily misunderstood. She needed to hold it close until she understood it herself. The hospital parking garage smelled like oil and disinfectant. Susan clipped her badge on and stepped into the elevator, nodding at a man she vaguely recognized from radiology. As the doors slid shut, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Thomas. Just seeing his name made her stomach flip an unexpected mix of relief and tension. She waited until she was alone in her office before opening the message. "Hope you made it home okay." No rush to respond. She stared at the screen longer than necessary, then typed back. "I did. Thank you. I'm at work now." A pause. Then the reply. "I won't keep you. Just wanted you to know I meant what I said." She set the phone face down, pressing her palm over it, as if to quiet the feeling in her chest. She had work to do, real work. Patients depending on her. Forms to process. Schedules to adjust. Life did not pause for emotional revelations. Across town, Thomas sat in a glass-walled conference room, hands folded neatly on the table. His expression neutral as a man from procurement droned on about timelines and contingencies. The city seal hung on the wall behind him, polished and severe. "Regarding Dalton Fitness Consulting," the man continued, clearing his throat. "We've reviewed the complaint that came in last night." Thomas did not react. He had known this would move quickly. "And there are multiple issues," the man said. "Behavioral concerns, prior reports we hadn't been aware of. It appears Mr. Dalton has a pattern." Thomas nodded once, then removed them from consideration. The man hesitated. "That will delay the project." Thomas leaned back, slightly, eyes sharp. "So will litigation." Silence settled over the table. Then the man nodded. "Understood." Thomas signed the document placed in front of him, his pen strokes clean and final. When the meeting ended, he remained seated for a moment, staring at the empty chairs. He felt no satisfaction, only a dull weight. Consequences were necessary. They were rarely pleasant. Mark Dalton found out just before noon. The email arrived while he was between clients, scrolling his phone with restless fingers. He opened it, skimmed the first line, then read it again more slowly. His jaw tightened. He slammed his phone down on the bench beside him, earning a startled glance from a woman tying her shoes nearby. He stormed out of the gym, dialing furiously. Voicemail, again and again. He drove across town, anger fueling every turn, every red light an insult. Susan was filing reports when her supervisor stopped by her office. "Hey," the woman said gently. "You okay?" Susan looked up, surprised. "Yes." "Why, you seem distracted," her supervisor said. "If you need a personal day, I'm fine," Susan said quickly, then softened her tone. "Really?" "Just a long night," her supervisor nodded. "All right. Don't forget the staff meeting at 4. Susan forced a smile. When the door closed, she exhaled shakily. She hated how easily the world seemed to sense her vulnerability, like a bruise visible beneath the skin. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" "Susan." Mark's voice snapped. "You think this is funny?" Her blood ran cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, don't play innocent," he said. "You went crying to someone. You ruined my contract." Susan stood, heart pounding. "I didn't tell anyone anything. You expect me to believe that?" Mark scoffed. "This just happens the morning after you embarrass me." Susan closed her eyes, grounding herself. "You embarrassed yourself," she said quietly. There was a pause. Then Mark laughed, sharp and humorless. "You really think you're untouchable now? You think hiding behind him makes you special?" "Do not call me again," Susan said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is harassment." "Oh, please," Mark replied. "You don't have the guts." She hung up. Her hands shook as she set the phone down. She stared at it, waiting for it to ring again. It didn't. She walked to the restroom and locked herself in a stall, breathing through the surge of adrenaline. Fear curled in her stomach, familiar and unwelcome. But beneath it, something else burned. Anger. Clean. Clarifying. Across town, Thomas received the call from his assistant as he stepped out of his building. "We've had an incident," she said. Dalton attempted to access the site. Security escorted him out. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "Is anyone hurt?" "No," she said. "But he's angry." Thomas's jaw set. "Document everything." He hung up and immediately dialed Susan's number. It rang twice before going to voicemail. He frowned, then left a message. "Susan, it's Thomas. If Mark contacts you again, you tell me. Or call the police. This isn't something you need to handle alone." Susan listened to the voicemail in the stall, tears blurring her vision. She wiped her face, squared her shoulders, and returned to her office. The rest of the day passed in a haze of charts and meetings and polite conversation. When she finally left the hospital, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. She drove home carefully, scanning her mirrors. No one followed her. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with a bowl of soup she barely touched. The phone lay beside her, silent. She thought of Thomas in his conference room, of Lily at home, doing homework, of Ruth with her quiet, knowing eyes. She thought of Mark, pacing, furious, unable to understand how the world had shifted beneath his feet. Her phone buzzed. "Thomas." "Are you safe?" Susan typed back. "Yes." "He called me. I told him not to. He hasn't since." The reply came almost immediately. "Good. That matters." She stared at the words, then typed. "I don't like this. The feeling of being connected to something bigger." "Neither do I." Thomas replied, "But sometimes it's already happened before we realize it." Susan leaned back in her chair, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. She thought of the woman she had been, yesterday morning, stepping into that diner, hoping for something small and manageable. She thought of the woman she was now aware of, how quickly power could turn, how cruelty could ripple outward, how kindness could entangle lives. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, one by one. Somewhere across the city, Mark sat alone, scrolling through job postings with shaking hands. Somewhere else, Thomas reviewed security reports, his face hard with resolve. And in her quiet kitchen, Susan made a choice she had been avoiding all day. She texted Thomas, "I don't want to be protected. I want to be respected. If this continues, I'll handle it my way. I just need you to trust me." There was a longer pause this time. Then the reply, "I do. And I will." Susan set the phone down, her pulse finally slowing. For the first time since the diner, She felt something like control return to her body. The night did not feel safe, but it felt honest, and that she realized might be enough to carry her forward. Susan learned quickly that fear doesn't disappear when you name it. It just changes its shape. The next few days passed in a tight, careful rhythm. Work, home, sleep that never quite reached her bones. Every unfamiliar car slowed her pulse. Every unknown number tightened her chest. Still, she showed up. That was new. She didn't call in sick. She didn't shrink her roots or lower her eyes. She walked through the hospital corridors with her shoulders back, aware of the tremor in her hands, but refusing to let it decide her steps. Thomas kept his distance the way he had promised. No hovering, no quiet rescues, just short messages. "Are you okay? Do you need anything? I'm here." The restraint mattered more than any grand gesture. It told her he was listening. Mark, on the other hand, grew louder in the spaces where no one could hear him. Online posts appeared vague, but pointed. Comments about women who play victims and men who pay for honesty. Susan didn't respond. She documented. Screenshots, dates, times. She surprised herself with how methodical she became. Power, she was learning, did not only belong to the people who wielded it loudly. On Thursday afternoon, the hospital held a town hall in the main auditorium. Folding chairs, lukewarm coffee, administrators in neutral suits. Susan sat near the aisle notebook on her lap, half listening until a familiar voice reached her from the stage. "We are honored to welcome Thomas Reed," the moderator said, smiling too widely. "Senior partner at Reed & Cole Development, overseeing the Regional Infrastructure Initiative." Susan's pen stopped. Thomas stepped into the light. Not the man from the diner. Not the quiet driver by the river. This version stood straight-backed, composed, his presence filling the space without effort. The room shifted. People leaned forward. Phones came out. Titles followed him like a wake. Susan felt heat rise in her face. He hadn't lied. He had simply left out the scale of it. Thomas spoke calmly about funding timelines accountability, about hospitals as living systems, about dignity in public spaces. His words were precise, practiced, but there was an undercurrent she recognized, conviction sharpened by restraint. Then he said something that made her breath catch. "We don't just build structures," Thomas said. "We shape environments. And how people behave inside them matters. How they treat each other matters. If our work supports cruelty, even indirectly, we've failed." A murmur rippled through the room. Susan understood then. This wasn't just about Mark. It never had been. The diner had been a spark. The fire had already been there. After the meeting, she waited, watched people surround him, hands extended, smiles practiced. She almost left, almost chose the familiar safety of avoidance. But something steadier held her in place. When Thomas finally noticed her, his expression changed. Not surprise, something like relief. "I should have told you," he said quietly when they were alone in the corridor. "Yes," Susan replied. "You should have." They stood there, the hallway humming with distant voices and rolling carts. The truth sat between them, heavy but solid. "Does it change how you see me?" he asked. Susan considered. "It explains things she said. It doesn't excuse them." Thomas nodded. "Fair." They walked together toward the exit. No hands touching, no rush. Outside, the air felt cleaner, sharper. "I don't want special treatment," Susan said. "I don't want to be part of leverage." "You're not," Thomas said. "You're part of reality." She studied him. "Mark called me again." Thomas's jaw tightened. "What did he say?" "That I was hiding behind you," Susan replied. "That I'd regret it. And I told him to stop," she said. "I told him I was documenting everything. I told him the next call would go to the police." Thomas exhaled slowly. "Good. I meant what I said," Susan added. "I want you to trust me." "I do," he said. Then, after a beat, "But trusting you doesn't mean I stop doing my job." She met his gaze. "And what is your job exactly?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Ensuring patterns don't repeat." That night, Mark made a mistake. A real one. He showed up at the diner. Maple Street was quieter than usual. The dinner rush long gone. The owner looked up from the counter as Mark pushed through the door, his expression hardening. "You're not welcome here," the owner said calmly. Mark laughed. "I'm not here for you." Susan felt him before she saw him. The air shifted. She turned slowly, heart-pounding anger flaring hot and immediate. "Say what you need to say," she told him. "Standing. Then leave." Mark's eyes flicked around the room. "Fewer witnesses than last time." He leaned in, voice low. "You think you won?" Susan held his gaze. "I think you're afraid." Mark sneered. "You don't know anything about fear." Susan smiled then, not kindly. "I know enough to recognize it." He took a step closer. The owner's hand hovered near the phone. "Walk away," Susan said. "This is your last chance." Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, face draining of color. He read the message twice. "What is it?" Susan asked quietly. Mark swallowed. "They terminated my lease," he muttered. "Effective immediately." Susan said nothing. "You think this is over?" Mark snapped, but the fight had gone out of him. "You think people like him don't destroy what they touch?" Susan leaned in just enough for him to hear. "You did this to yourself." Mark stood there shaking, then turned and left without another word. Across the street, a familiar black sedan idled. Thomas watched through the windshield, face unreadable. He hadn't planned to intervene. He hadn't needed to. Susan had handled it. Later, as they walked to their cars, Susan stopped him. "I know who you are now," she said. "I know what you can do." Thomas waited. "And I'm still here," she finished. Something in his expression softened. "So am I." They stood there, under the streetlight, two people no longer pretending the world was smaller than it was. Power hung in the air, not as a weapon, but as a responsibility neither of them could ignore. Susan unlocked her car, then paused. "Next time," she said, "no secrets." Thomas nodded. Next time, he agreed. As she drove away, Susan realized something had shifted again. Not the danger, not the stakes, but her place within them. She was no longer reacting. She was choosing. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and the anger and the long years of being underestimated, a quiet certainty took hold. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment the balance changed. Susan dreamed of the diner again, but this time the room was empty. No clatter of plates, no murmured conversations. Just her and the table where she had once sat, waiting for someone to decide whether she was worth staying for. In the dream, the chair across from her never filled. She woke before dawn, with her heart racing, the echo of that emptiness pressing against her ribs. She lay still, listening to the early morning quiet, the distant rush of traffic, the soft click of the heater cycling on. The fear was still there, but it no longer owned the room. She swung her legs out of bed and stood, grounding herself in the cool floor, reminding her body that she was awake, that the moment had passed. By the time she reached the hospital, the sky was streaked with pale orange. She moved through the corridors with practiced ease, greeting co-workers, reviewing charts, answering questions. To anyone watching, she looked the same. Inside, something had shifted into alignment. She was no longer waiting for the next blow. She was braced for it, ready. At mid-morning, security called her office. "Ms. Miller, we need you downstairs." Her pulse jumped, then steadied. "Why?" "There's someone here asking for you," the guard said. "We're holding him at the front desk." Susan closed her eyes for half a second. "Is it Mark Dalton?" A pause. "Yes, ma'am." She exhaled slowly. "I'll be right there. Do not let him past the desk." She didn't call Thomas. That choice mattered. Mark stood stiffly near the entrance, hands jammed into his jacket pockets, eyes darting toward the exits. He looked smaller here, stripped of the gym mirrors and loud music that usually reinforced his image. When he saw Susan approach, his mouth tightened. "You can't keep doing this," he said immediately. "You're ruining my life." Susan stopped several feet away. A security guard shifted subtly beside her. "You came to my workplace," she said calmly. "That's not okay. I just need to explain." Mark insisted. This all got out of hand. Susan studied him, the flushed skin, the tension coiled beneath it. She saw the desperation, now raw and unfiltered. It did not soften her. "You had your chances," she said. "Multiple ones. You chose not to use them." Mark laughed bitterly. "You think you're better than me now?" "No." Susan replied, "I think I'm done with you." He opened his mouth again, but the guard stepped forward. "Sir, you need to leave." Mark looked at Susan one last time, searching her face for something. Vindication, fear, regret. He found none of it. "This isn't over," he said weakly. "It is for me," Susan answered. The doors closed behind him with a soft finality. Susan stood there for a moment, letting her body catch up with the decision she had just enforced. Her hands were steady. She returned to her office, closed the door, and sat down. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She opened a file and documented the encounter with the same precision she brought to her work every day. Across town, Thomas sat in his car outside a school watching Lily through the fence as she chased friends across the playground. Her laughter carried faintly through the glass. He thought of Susan standing her ground without him, and something in his chest loosened. Ruth noticed his expression when he came to pick Lily up. "You look different," she said, as Lily ran ahead. "I feel different," Thomas replied. "About her?" "Yes." Ruth smiled knowingly. "Good. It's about time you stopped trying to manage everything alone." That evening, Susan agreed to meet Thomas at the river overlook again. Not out of obligation, out of choice. They stood side by side, hands tucked into their coats, watching the water slide past in the fading light. No small talk, no pretense. "He came to the hospital," Susan said. Thomas's head snapped toward her. "Are you okay?" "Yes," she said. "Security handled it." "I handled it." Thomas exhaled slowly. "I'm proud of you." She met his gaze. "I didn't do it for you." "I know," he said. "That's why it matters." They stood in silence, the city humming around them. "I don't want to be a subplot in your life," Susan said finally. "I don't want to be the woman who taught you a lesson or reminded you of something you forgot." Thomas turned fully toward her now. "You're not," he said. "You're not an example or a symbol. You're a person I respect." She studied him, searching for the familiar red flags. Control, ownership, expectation. She found none. "And I don't want to be impressed by your power," she added. "I want to know how you use it." Thomas nodded. "Then you should know this. I've turned down 3 projects this week." Susan raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because they would have made people like Mark invisible and untouchable," he said. "Because I don't want to build things that protect men who mistake dominance for worth." Susan felt a slow, steady warmth spread through her chest. Not infatuation, alignment. They talked, then really talked, about past marriages, about mistakes neither could undo, about the loneliness that settles in when life doesn't follow the script you were handed. Thomas spoke of nights staring at blueprints long after everyone else had gone home. Susan spoke of patience she still thought about years later. When they parted, there was no kiss, just a shared understanding that neither of them was rushing toward an ending. They were building something that could hold weight. Later that night, Mark sat alone in his apartment, the walls bare where motivational posters used to hang. His phone lay face down on the table. He didn't turn it over. He knew there would be nothing there. For the first time in years, there was no one left to blame. Susan slept through the night. The next morning, she stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her jacket. She paused, met her own gaze, and held it. The voice that used to tear her down was quieter now. Not gone, but manageable. Her phone buzzed as she reached for her keys. "Thomas, breakfast tomorrow." "No agenda." Susan smiled. "Susan, okay, but only if we walk afterward." "Thomas, deal." As she stepped out into the morning light, Susan understood something she hadn't before. Power didn't just change the balance between people. It revealed it. And for the first time, she wasn't standing on the weaker side, hoping someone would notice. She had noticed herself. Breakfast tasted different when no one was auditioning. Susan noticed it as soon as she sat down, the clink of cutlery softer, the coffee richer somehow, as if the morning itself had agreed to slow its pace. The cafe was small and unremarkable, the kind of place retirees favored because the chairs were sturdy and the noise never got too loud. Thomas arrived a minute late, coat still dusted with cold eyes, apologetic but calm. "Traffic," he said. "Life," Susan replied. They ordered without ceremony. Eggs, toast, nothing performative. Through the window, a bus wheezed to a stop. Passengers stepping down carefully, each one carrying a private history, Susan imagined without effort. She felt grounded here. Ordinary. That mattered. "I've been thinking about what you said," Thomas began, stirring his coffee. "About not wanting to be impressed by power." Susan smiled faintly. And I realized how often people mistake access for authority," he said. "I've benefited from that confusion." Susan watched him closely. There was no defensiveness in his voice, no rehearsed humility, just recognition. "I don't want you to benefit from it," she said. "Not with me." "I won't," Thomas replied. "Not unless you ask." The waitress returned with their plates, interrupting the moment. They ate in comfortable silence, the conversation resuming naturally, drifting toward lighter ground. Lily's science project, a hospital fundraiser Susan was coordinating. The weather. The rhythm felt earned. After breakfast, they walked. The sidewalk followed the river for a few blocks, leaves skittering at their feet. Susan kept her hands in her pockets, feeling the steady burn in her calves, the pull of gravity reminding her she was present in her body. "Do you ever worry," she asked suddenly, "that this is just momentum?" Thomas glanced at her. "Explain." "That we're responding to pressure," she said. "Not choosing." He considered this. "I think pressure reveals choices," he said. "It doesn't make them." Susan nodded slowly. She could live with that answer. They stopped at the railing overlooking the water. The current moved steadily, indifferent to them. Susan liked that. It made her feel smaller in a way that was relieving, not diminishing. "I got a call from legal this morning," Thomas said. Susan tensed, then relaxed. "About Mark?" "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "He filed a complaint." "Of course he did," Susan said dryly. "It won't go anywhere," Thomas added. "But it will be unpleasant." Susan turned to him. "I don't want updates. I don't want to feel like this is something happening for me." Thomas nodded. "Understood." They walked on. That afternoon, Susan returned to the hospital with a strange lightness in her chest. She focused better, listened more. When a young nurse asked her for advice, she gave it without hesitation, surprised by how natural it felt. Leadership, she realized, didn't always come with a title. In the early evening, Thomas attended a community forum at a high school auditorium. Folding chairs again, microphones that squealed. He spoke about transparency, about oversight, about responsibility that extended beyond contracts. In the third row, a woman raised her hand and asked why developers were never held accountable when things went wrong. Thomas met her gaze. "They should be," he said. "Including me." The room went quiet. Susan wasn't there to see it, but she would hear about it later, the way his voice had steadied, the way he had not deflected. That night, Susan cooked for herself. Nothing elaborate. Pasta, vegetables. She ate at the table, not in front of the television. When her phone buzzed, she didn't jump. Thomas. How was your day? Susan full. In a good way. Thomas mine too. She considered, then typed. Susan. I want to take things slowly, but I don't want to pretend I don't feel something. The reply came after a pause that felt respectful rather than hesitant. Thomas. Then let's agree not to lie to ourselves or each other. She smiled, set the phone down, and washed the dishes. Across town, Mark sat in his car outside the gym that had once welcomed him. The lights were off. His name was gone from the door. He scrolled through messages that went unanswered. For the first time, there was no audience to perform for, no mirror to reinforce the story he had told himself. The silence pressed in. Susan slept deeply that night. The following week unfolded with small, deliberate steps. Coffee again. A walk through a public garden. A dinner where they cooked together and argued gently about seasoning. Susan noticed how Thomas listened, how he adjusted without making a show of it. He noticed how she spoke more freely, how the tension in her shoulders eased. One evening, as they sat on opposite ends of the couch, Susan said, I'm afraid. Thomas didn't reach for her. Of what? Of losing this version of myself, she said. The one who doesn't apologize for being here. You won't, he said. Not with me. She believed him. Not because of what he promised, because of how he behaved. At work, Susan's supervisor mentioned a leadership role opening up. You'd be good at it, she said. You have presence. Susan walked home that day, with the word echoing in her head. Presence. She thought of the diner, of standing her ground, of speaking calmly while fear rattled inside her. Maybe presence wasn't something you were born with. Maybe it was something you practiced. On Saturday, Thomas invited her to Lily's school play. Susan hesitated, then agreed. She sat in the back row, hands folded, watching Lily scan the audience before spotting her father and breaking into a grin so wide it made Susan laugh. Afterward, Lily ran up to her. You came, she said, breathless. I did, Susan replied. Lily studied her. You look happier. Susan knelt to Lily's level. I feel stronger. Lily considered this, then nodded solemnly. That's better. Thomas watched the exchange, something like wonder crossing his face. Later, as they walked to the car, Susan took a breath. I don't want to rush, she said, but I'm not pulling away either. Thomas stopped turning to face her fully. Neither am I. They stood there under the glow of the parking lot lights, not touching, not needing to. The space between them felt intentional, charged, but calm. Susan understood then that this chapter wasn't about rescue or revenge. It wasn't even about romance, not yet. It was about alignment. About two lives adjusting their trajectories, just enough to move forward, without colliding or disappearing. As she drove home, Susan caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. She looked tired. She looked real. She looked like someone who had stopped waiting for permission. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, folded once, slipped under Susan's apartment door, sometime between her morning coffee and the sound of the mail truck pulling away. She noticed it only because it wasn't addressed to anyone else in the building. No stamp, no return address. just her name, written carefully, almost politely. She stood there longer than she meant to, keys still in her hand, listening for footsteps in the hallway. Nothing. The building settled around her old pipes, ticking a radio, murmuring somewhere behind a closed door. She picked up the envelope and felt its weight. Not heavy, but deliberate. Inside was a single page. Susan. I'm writing because I've been advised not to contact you directly. I'm trying to do the right thing now, even if it's late. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect a response. I just need to say this without an audience. What I said to you that night wasn't honesty. It was cruelty, dressed up as preference. I've told myself for years that being blunt makes me strong. I see now it just made me careless with other people. I lost more than a contract. I lost the version of myself that believed I was untouchable. That's on me. I won't bother you again. Mark Dalton. Susan lowered the letter slowly, her fingers trembling despite herself. She read it again, slower this time, noticing the absence of excuses, the lack of self-pity. She felt no rush of relief, no triumph, just a quiet, complicated heaviness. She folded the letter back into its envelope and set it on the table. Then she sat down and stared at the wall until her breathing evened out. Later that afternoon, she met Thomas at a public park, the kind with wide paths and benches spaced far enough apart that people could exist near each other without intrusion. The air smelled like cut grass and impending rain. He noticed the change in her immediately. What happened? Susan handed him the letter without a word. Thomas read it once, then again. He didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was careful. How do you feel? Susan considered the question seriously. Unsettled, she said. Not angry. Not relieved. Just aware. Thomas nodded. That makes sense. I don't want this to be the end of him, she added. But I also don't want to carry him anymore. You don't have to, Thomas said. You already chose not to. Susan watched a couple walk past, pushing a stroller, their conversation low and intimate. Do you think people change? She asked. Thomas followed her gaze. I think some people stop lying to themselves, he said. That's usually where change starts. Susan leaned back on the bench. I don't know if I want to reply. You don't owe him closure, Thomas said. Not even the good kind. She nodded. I know. They sat in silence, the sky darkening slightly as clouds rolled in. That evening, Susan received an email from her supervisor. The leadership role had been approved. Temporary at first, a trial period. Susan stared at the screen, a familiar flicker of doubt rising, then settling. She typed back, yes. Across town, Thomas sat at his dining table with Lily and Ruth. Homework spread out, soup cooling in bowls. Lily chattered about a classmate who had been teased for wearing the same jacket 2 days in a row. What did you do? Thomas asked gently. I told them to stop. Lily said matter-of-factly, and I told her she could sit with me. Ruth smiled. Good. Thomas caught the look his mother gave him. What? Nothing, Ruth said. Just noticing patterns. Later, after Lily was asleep, Thomas stood at the window phone in his hand. He typed erased, then typed again. "Thomas, how are you holding up?" Susan replied a few minutes later. Susan processing, but steady. "Thomas, that's good." Susan hesitated, then added, "Susan, he wrote me a letter." Thomas's response came quickly. "Thomas, do you want to talk about it?" Susan, "Not tonight." Thomas, "Okay." She appreciated the restraint. The following days were quiet. No new messages from Mark. No surprises. Susan threw the letter away without ceremony on Friday morning, watching it disappear into the bin like something finished. She didn't feel lighter. She felt clearer. At work, she stepped into her new role, cautiously listening more than she spoke. People responded to her calm, to her decisiveness. She noticed the way younger staff straightened when she entered a room, not out of fear, but expectation. On Saturday, Thomas invited her to dinner at his place. Ruth would be out. Lily had a sleepover. Susan arrived with a bottle of wine and nerves she didn't bother hiding. The house smelled like wood polish and something savory simmering on the stove. It felt lived in, comfortable. They cooked together, bumping elbows, negotiating space. It felt intimate without being charged. "I don't want to rush this," Susan said as they ate. "But I don't want to pretend I'm not aware of where this could go." Thomas nodded. "Neither do I." She studied him. "Are you ready for something real?" He didn't answer immediately. "I'm ready to be honest," he said. "That's what I can promise." Susan considered that. "That's enough." After dinner, they sat on opposite ends of the couch, a quiet movie playing they both ignored. At one point, Thomas reached for her hand. He didn't pull her closer. He just held it warm and steady. Susan felt something settle in her chest. Not certainty. Something better. Choice without pressure. Outside rain began to fall light at first, then steady. Later that night, Susan stood in Thomas's kitchen watching him rinse dishes. She thought of the diner, of the letter, of the woman she had been before any of this began. "I'm not afraid of being hurt," she said suddenly. "I'm afraid of disappearing again." Thomas turned off the water and faced her fully. "You won't," he said. "Not here." She searched his face for anything that sounded like ownership. Found none. "Then stay," she said quietly. Thomas stepped closer, careful giving her space to retreat if she wanted. She didn't. Their first kiss was unremarkable in the ways that mattered. No urgency, no spectacle, just a shared decision, deliberate and grounded. Susan closed her eyes and felt the moment for what it was. Not an ending, not a victory. A beginning built on clarity rather than longing. Later, driving home through the rain, Susan realized she wasn't replaying Mark's words anymore. She was replaying her own voice. Calm, steady, present. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, she trusted herself to walk it without shrinking. The first thing Susan noticed was how ordinary happiness looked when it finally arrived. Not fireworks, not declarations shouted across rooms, just mornings that didn't feel heavy, evenings that didn't require armor, and a quiet confidence that stayed even when Thomas wasn't beside her. The weeks that followed their first kiss unfolded without drama, without urgency, the way real lives tend to move when no one is trying to prove anything. She settled into her new role at the hospital with a steadiness that surprised her colleagues and herself. Meetings no longer drained her. Decisions no longer came with an apology attached. When a disagreement surfaced, she addressed it directly, her voice calm, her posture grounded. People listened, not because she was loud, because she was clear. Leadership, she learned, wasn't about control. It was about presence sustained over time. Thomas watched the change with a careful pride he never tried to claim. He showed up when invited. He stayed quiet when silence was needed. When projects crossed his desk that mirrored the old patterns, he pushed back harder than before, not out of anger, but out of alignment. His name still opened doors, but now it also closed a few. He accepted that without resentment. Lily noticed everything. She noticed how Susan laughed more easily, how she didn't flinch when people entered a room, how her voice stayed steady, even when conversations turned sharp. One afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table coloring, Lily looked up and said, "You're different now." Susan paused, then smiled. "So are you." Lily considered, this nodded, and went back to her drawing satisfied. Mark disappeared from their lives without ceremony. No more letters, no more calls. His name faded into something abstract, a reminder rather than a threat. Susan didn't celebrate that. She simply let it be. Healing, she learned, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about not letting it dictate the present. On a crisp autumn evening, Thomas invited Susan to the diner again. Not the same table, not the same circumstances. They sat near the window this time, the room warm with familiar faces, the owner nodding in recognition but keeping his distance. No one stared. No one whispered. The moment belonged to them alone. "You okay being here?" Thomas asked quietly. Susan looked around. The hum of conversation, the clink of plates, the ordinary life continuing without regard for old wounds. "Yes," she said, and she meant it. They ate slowly, talked about nothing important, the kind of nothing that meant everything. When they stood to leave, Susan caught her reflection in the glass. She didn't look smaller. She didn't look harder. She looked like herself, fully present, unafraid to take up space. That night, lying in her own bed, Susan thought about the woman she had been before the diner. The careful one, the apologetic one, the one who measured herself by other people's standards. She didn't feel anger toward her, only gratitude. That woman had survived long enough to become this one. Thomas felt it too, the shift. Not in Susan alone, but in himself. The quiet understanding that strength didn't require constant defense. That love didn't need leverage. That choosing someone every day without spectacle was its own kind of power. Months passed. Seasons changed. Life continued in its uneven, beautiful way. There were disagreements. There were tired nights. There were moments when old fears knocked quietly at the door. But they were answered differently now. With honesty, with patience, with the shared knowledge that neither of them needed to disappear to be loved. On a Sunday afternoon, Susan stood in the hospital hallway, watching a younger nurse hesitate before speaking up in a meeting. Susan caught her eye and nodded once. The nurse straightened and spoke. The room shifted. Susan felt a quiet satisfaction settle in her chest. Later that evening, walking along the river with Thomas, Susan stopped and leaned against the railing, watching the water move steadily forward. "I used to think being chosen was the goal," she said. "Now I think choosing myself was." Thomas didn't interrupt. He simply stood beside her, present as always. They walked on the city lights, reflecting across the water, the path familiar now. No urgency, no fear of falling behind. Just two people moving forward at a pace they could sustain. If you're still here, still listening, still feeling the echo of Susan's story, let it sit with you for a moment. Some nights change us with cruelty. Others change us with quiet courage. Sometimes the smallest acts of dignity reshape an entire life. If this story resonated, take a second to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. And if you've ever found your strength in an unexpected moment, comment 3 words that matter to you. Stand your ground.